Hello students, and welcome to Labor Economics. Today I'm going to give you a brief overview of the course. So why should you care about learning labor economics? Well, for most of your life you're going to be exchanging your labor services for money. Labor economics is a study of how these labor markets work, in which you'll be trading your labor for a wage. Labor markets determine our income, and so of course they determine our wealth and how much money we'll have to spend on goods and services. And also it will determine how much leisure we have to take vacations. So overall, labor economics gives you a really solid framework to analyze many different social and economic problems. We're going to look at some important questions in this course. One is, do minimum wages increase the employment rate of less skilled workers? Do social programs that are meant to help the poor have some unintended consequences, like providing for a disincentive to work? Do wage and tax subsidies from the government encourage firms to increase employment? What is the impact of safety and health regulations on employment and earnings? Does it make workers better off, worse off, happier, or more unhappy? Are government subsidies of investment in human capital an effective way to improve the economic well-being of disadvantaged workers? So to begin with, let's talk about a market. Let's refresh our ideas from introductory economics and talk about a market. Economics in general is a study of how people behave in markets. It's a study of the interactions between decision makers, and that occurs in markets for goods and services or other commodities. So on the right, I have a diagram of a typical market for a good or service. You have your demand curve, which is downward sloping, and that's because we believe consumers will purchase less if the price is higher and vice versa. So there's an inverse relationship. We also have the supply curve, and that's representing the firm's behavior. The higher the price, the more a firm would want to offer for sale on a market. And we have the equilibrium, which is P star and Q star. These are the market clearing prices. And what we call P star, the market clearing price. And that's because only at P star will the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied be the same. At any other price than the equilibrium price, we will have either a shortage or a surplus. If there's a surplus, for example, if the price in the market were above P star, we would have a surplus, and firms would not want to keep overproducing. They would want to lower the price to get rid of that surplus amount. Alternatively, if the P star is below, if the price is below P star, we will have a shortage. And if there's a shortage, there'll be upward pressure on the price. So there's a tendency in a market for the price to go towards the intersection of the demand and supply curve, which is the equilibrium. And so many times we're interested in the determinants of equilibrium prices and the quantities of goods traded. What's different about the labor market? Well, labor economics is the study of just one particular commodity, and that's obviously labor services. A formal definition is labor economics involves analyzing the determinants of the various dimensions of labor supply and labor demand and their interaction in alternative market structures to determine wages, employment, and unemployment. So we will be looking not only at competitive markets, but also market structures such as a monopoly. So here's our standard market for goods and services. Here we have price and quantity, so this is the same diagram that we just saw. And if you remember, behind the demand curve were consumers, and behind the supply curve were firms. So the interaction of demand and supply in a market, or in other words, the interaction of the firms and the consumers, results in a price and quantity. Now, how does the labor market differ? Well, what's the price in the labor market? Well, what's the good that we're talking about? Well, labor. So what's the price of labor? Well, the price of labor is the wage. Okay, so here we have wage on the vertical axis, On the horizontal axis, we have the quantity of labor. So we can think of this as the quantity of labor hired. It could be in number of workers or hours, depending on the context. If you haven't thought of this already, you should notice that here the demand curve is not consumers, but it represents the behavior of firms, because firms are the ones that are going to demand labor. The supply curve is for workers, and this shows the relationship between wages and how much labor they would want to supply. The higher the wage, more people would want to supply labor because they're getting paid more. So it's a positive relationship. So who are the main actors? Well, we've already talked about two of them, workers and firms, of course. And as you may remember from your microeconomics course, there's no pure market economy. There's always some role for governance, because markets, although they're very good at being efficient, they can also provide negative externalities. So they're not always perfect, and so there's always a role for governments to sort of keep the market in check. Okay, so we have three actors: workers, firms, and governments. Now, workers, workers are the most important factor, right? Without workers, there is no labor market. Workers' main objective is to maximize their utility. So in our models, that will be one of our assumptions. They're going to select the best option from available choices to make them the happiest. There tends to be a positive relationship between their working time and payoffs, and we'll look at a model of this later on in the course. Workers' decisions, well, workers decide when to enter the labor force. Workers decide how much training and schooling they should get, what occupation or industry they should work in, how much to work, and if they're in a job, they can decide whether or not to quit and try and look for a new job. Firms, well, firms are motivated to maximize profits, of course. The relationship between their demand for labor and wages is going to be negative. It's going to be an inverse relationship. The more they have to pay, the less they want to hire. And what type of decisions do firms want to make? Well, they want to decide that they're going to have to decide how many workers to hire, what to pay the workers. Should they offer non-wage benefits such as bonuses, commissions, or benefits, health benefits, for example? They decide how many hours workers should work. They also decide whether or not to lay off workers or file for bankruptcy. And they also make decisions regarding the retirement policy for employees. So this isn't an exhaustive list, but this is some of the more important decisions that firms will make. The government, of course, will provide some ground rules that guides voluntary exchange in labor markets. So they'll impose things like taxes, regulations. For example, if a firm decided that it wants its workers to work 18 hours a day, that may not be something desirable for society. And so there are usually regulations that prevent such type of long working hours. The government has a job in which they have to, there's a trade-off between individual rights and employer competitiveness. They also can provide training, insurance, such as unemployment insurance for workers in case they get laid off. And they also have regulations around compensation, for example, the minimum wage. The key labor market outcomes are wages and employment, unemployment, labor shortages, and wage differential. These are important outcomes that we will be looking at in the course. And there are a number of influences that can affect these outcomes. Of course, legislative interventions. So any government interference in the market will change the outcomes. Unions and collective bargaining will certainly affect wages and employment. And of course, the market structure in which the firms and workers are operating in will have an important effect on the labor market outcomes. And this is true for both the product and labor markets. An overarching theme in the course is the neoclassical model, which is the neoclassical supply and demand model. And this is the workhorse of labor economics. Many of the broad range of outcomes can be distilled into two variables, employment and wages. And these can go a long way into explaining a whole host of different labor market outcomes. So the key ingredients in the neoclassical model are behavioral assumptions about how the buyers and sellers, those are the two players, respond to prices and other factors. So the firm's behavior is represented by the labor demand curve. The worker's behavior is represented by the labor supply curve, and the interaction of supply and demand results in an equilibrium employment and wages. So much of this course is looking into and understanding what goes on behind the scenes for the labor demand curve and the labor supply curve. So our study of labor economics can shed light on many different policy issues. In terms of labor supply, our model can help analyze things such as the work incentive effects of income maintenance and tax transfer programs, employment insurance. Does a longer duration of employment insurance affect labor supply? Will less people look for jobs? Welfare, and if there's a welfare system, does that create a disincentive for those people to work? Does the subsidization of daycare allow people to return to the labor force, or does it provide a disincentive to work? So we'll be looking at these issues in detail throughout the course. In terms of labor demand, there are many issues related to that as well. The labor demand effects of globalization and outsourcing. So how does that affect, say, domestic demand for labor? Trade policies, how does that affect labor demand? Collective bargaining, does that result in firms wanting to hire less workers, more workers? Minimum wages, of course, we will talk about. Workplace health and safety regulations. Do workplace and health safety regulations make workers happier, less happy? How do they affect the labor market? So what's next? In the next lecture, we're going to look at how the labor force is defined. And from that, we're going to learn how to calculate the unemployment rate and participation rate. And then we're going to move on to the basic income leisure model. In this model, we're looking at the theory of an individual decision to work. So we'll see you then. Thank you very much. Bye now.